It was a quiet night when the call came in. I was finishing up my shift, ready to head home. Nothing unusual that day, just the usual noise complaints and minor disturbances. But then, a call came in that changed everything. It was a woman, her voice trembling, gasping for air, saying someone was in her house. Dispatch didn't have much more information beyond that. The address was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever happens. I grabbed my gear and headed out, thinking this would probably be another case of a scared homeowner mistaking a shadow for an intruder. When I arrived, the house was dark except for a single porch light flickering as if it was struggling to stay alive. I knocked on the door, announced myself, and waited. No response. Dispatch had mentioned that the woman was hiding upstairs, too afraid to move. I called out again, louder this time, and still nothing. With my hand resting on the holster, I turned the knob. It was unlocked. As soon as I stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavy. I could smell something faint, like old copper, but I shrugged it off. I called out again louder, but still got no response. I heard nothing at all, in fact, not even the usual creaks or distant hums a house would make. Just silence. Cautiously, I made my way upstairs. The house felt wrong, like it had been abandoned for years despite looking perfectly normal from the outside. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but my training kept me moving forward. I approached the bedroom where the woman was supposed to be hiding. The door was cracked open, and as I pushed it, the hinges groaned like they hadn't been used in ages. Inside, the room was empty, no sign of the woman. I checked the closet, under the bed, everywhere. There was no one here. I was about to radio in when I heard something, a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood, coming from the attic. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the ceiling, where a pull-down ladder was nestled. The sound continued, a steady rhythmic scrape, 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 sending chills down my spine. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. This wasn't part of the job. The police academy doesn't prepare you for things like this. But something, maybe stubbornness or curiosity, drove me to pull down that ladder. As the ladder unfolded, the scraping stopped. Silence again. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I climbed the steps, one by one, until I reached the top. The attic was pitch black, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick shadows. Then, I saw it, a figure huddled in the far corner, facing away from me. It was the woman. Or at least, it looked like her. I called out, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, motionless, her back to me. I inched closer, my flashlight illuminating more of her form. She was trembling, but not out of fear. It was something deeper, more primal, as if her very soul was vibrating with terror. I took a deep breath and stepped forward.
"Man,"
I said, my voice barely above a whisper.
"are you all right?"
Slowly, too slowly, she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were wide, impossibly wide, filled with a darkness that seemed to stretch into eternity. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a soft, wet gurgle. And then as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, her head twisted all the way around, her neck cracking like dry wood. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and that's when I heard it again, the scraping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the woman. It was coming from the walls. I scrambled for my flashlight, flicking it back on, the beam shaking in my hand. The walls were moving.
No. Crawling.
Hundreds of tiny fingers, pale and thin, were poking out from the cracks in the wood, scraping, reaching for something. For me. I ran. I didn't look back. I could hear them, the fingers or whatever they were, skittering behind me, growing louder, faster. I hit the stairs, leaping down two at a time, feeling the house itself closing in around me. The air grew heavier, suffocating, as if the walls were alive, breathing, waiting to swallow me whole. I burst out the front door and into the night, gasping for air. The house was silent again. Just standing there, mocking me, as if nothing had ever happened. I radioed for backup, my hands still shaking, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. The other officers arrived within minutes, but when they searched the house, there was nothing. No woman.
No fingers.
No signs of anything unusual. They looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was. But I know what I saw. And I'll never forget the sound of that scraping. That night, I quit the force. Some houses are better left alone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old pipes in my apartment, every gust of wind outside my window felt like the scraping I had heard in that house. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing that woman's head twisting around, her vacant eyes locked on me. The next day, I got a call from the department. They said they needed me to come in to file an official statement about the incident. My resignation hadn't even been processed yet. I dreaded going back, but I had to face it. I walked into the precinct, and everything felt surreal. The familiar faces, the usual banter among the officers, it all seemed so detached, so far from the nightmare I just lived. They sat me down with the detective assigned to the case, a guy named Harris. He was a veteran, old school. He listened quietly as I recounted what happened, his face unreadable. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then, Harris leaned forward, his voice low. "You know, you're not the first one, right?"
My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean?
He glanced around the room as if making sure no one was listening. "That house, there's something wrong with it. You're not the first officer who's come back with a story like this. But none of those reports ever make it to paper." I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. Why? Why doesn't anyone talk about it? Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. Because no one wants to believe it. Cops are supposed to deal with facts, with evidence.
Ghost stories? Things we can't explain?
Those don't belong in our world. But every few years, someone gets a call to that address, and something like what you described happens. Sometimes it's worse.
Worse?
I could barely breathe.
He nodded.
A couple years back, there was an officer, Daniels.
Good guy, solid cop.
He got a call from that same house. Went in, same as you.
Came out different.
Never talked about what he saw, but he wasn't right after that. 2 months later, he put a bullet in his head. I felt sick. What the hell is in that house? Harris shrugged, but I could see the fear in his eyes.
No one knows.
There've been stories about it going back decades. People disappearing, weird sounds, even murders. But nothing ever sticks. Every time, it's like the house cleans itself up. No evidence, no bodies, just nothing. It's like the place doesn't want to be found out. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. So what now? What am I supposed to do? Harris stood up, grabbing a file from his desk.
You move on.
Get out of here. Go live your life. The department will mark it down as a false alarm, like they always do. But if I were you, I'd stay far away from that place. Whatever it is, it doesn't like visitors. I left the precinct with a knot in my stomach. Harris's words echoed in my head as I drove home. It doesn't like visitors. That night, I tried to push it all out of my mind. I wanted to believe it was just some horrible dream, a trick of the mind.
But deep down, I knew better. A week passed.
I was doing my best to avoid thinking about that house, trying to get back to normal. But then, something strange happened. It started with small things, things in my apartment not being where I left them. The door to my closet creaking open in the middle of the night. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again.
The scraping.
It started late one night as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. At first, it was faint, almost like my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging slowly across the floorboards. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was coming from the walls. I jumped out of bed, throwing on the lights, hoping, praying, that I was imagining things. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, like something was moving through the walls, trying to find its way in. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but then I froze. What could I even tell them? That something was in my walls? That I was hearing noises from a house I hadn't been near in over a week? I paced around my apartment, my mind racing.
And then, the sound stopped.
Just like that. I stood there, breathless, waiting for it to start again. But all I heard was silence.
I didn't sleep that night.
Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it. Something watching me, waiting. The next morning, I decided to call Harris. He needed to know that whatever was in that house wasn't staying there anymore. But when I called the precinct, I got the worst news possible. Harris was dead. He'd been found in his apartment the night before. They said it looked like a heart attack, but there was something in the officer's voice, something that told me there was more to it. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. This thing, it was following me. It had followed Harris. And now, it was coming for me. I packed a bag that day. Left the city. I don't know where I'm going, but I know one thing for sure. You can't outrun it. Whatever it is, wherever it came from, it doesn't care about distance. It doesn't care about walls. And it doesn't stop. The scraping has started again tonight. This time, it's coming from inside my apartment. I froze. The sound of scraping wasn't just coming from the walls anymore, it was inside the room. My skin prickled, and every hair on my body stood up as I realized it wasn't the faint, distant noise from before. This was closer, deliberate, and it felt like it was circling me. I didn't want to move, but instinct kicked in. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a metal flashlight, and crept toward the door, every muscle in my body tight with fear. My breaths came in short gasps, each one sounding deafening in the otherwise silent room. The only thing louder than my breathing was the scrape, scrape, scrape that continued, slow and methodical. I don't know why I didn't just run, why I didn't throw myself out of that apartment and never look back. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe it was the part of me that still thought I was a cop, trained to confront whatever threat came my way. But deep down I knew, I wasn't equipped to handle this.
No one was.
I edged toward the bedroom door, my fingers slick with sweat as I reached for the knob. Just as I was about to turn it, the scraping stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, paralyzed by indecision.
And then I heard it. A whisper.
Faint, so low that I thought I was imagining it at first. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the bed.
Come here.
I whipped around, the flashlight beam dancing across the room, illuminating nothing but the walls, the bed, the furniture, all in their usual places.
But I heard it. That voice.
My heart hammered in my chest as I backed toward the door, not taking my eyes off the room for a second. Just as my hand wrapped around the knob, I heard the voice again, louder this time, clearer.
You can't leave.
I yanked the door open and bolted out of the room, my footsteps thundering down the hallway. The hallway seemed longer than usual, stretching out like a nightmare, the walls warping and closing in around me. I could feel it behind me, something following, something wrong. That voice, whispering and scraping, echoing in my head. When I reached the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The front door, the door I had planned to run through, was gone. The wall where the door should have been was now solid.
No knob, no frame.
Just drywall, smooth and untouched, like the door had never existed. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt lightheaded, my mind spinning. This wasn't possible. I knew I had a front door. I'd walked through it 100 times. I stared at the blank wall, my hand reaching out to where the doorknob should have been, brushing against nothing but cold plaster. The whispering returned, but this time it wasn't from behind me. It was all around me, coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside me. You can't leave. You're part of it now. I staggered backward, my body trembling as the whispers grew louder, overlapping, a chorus of voices that seemed to be coming from every direction. My head felt like it was splitting open, and I fell to my knees, gripping my skull as if I could physically block out the noise. That's when the walls started to move. At first, it was subtle, like the paint was rippling. But then, I saw them, fingers long and thin, pressing through the surface of the walls, just like in that house. Pale, sickly fingers, hundreds of them, pushing through the plaster, clawing their way into the room. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the couch as I tried to get away. The fingers twisted and bent, dragging across the walls, making that god-awful scraping sound. The whispers turned into a deafening roar. You'll never escape. The fingers kept coming, more and more of them, filling the room, reaching out for me. They slithered toward the floor, writhing like worms, stretching closer. My vision blurred with terror as I felt something cold wrap around my ankle, a hand. It squeezed, pulling me toward the wall. I kicked wildly, my heel slamming into whatever was holding me. It let go with a hiss, but more fingers were already closing in. I crawled backward, my hands scrabbling against the floor, trying to find something, anything to defend myself. And then, as if mocking me, the room shifted. The walls warped again, folding inward, and I realized with a sickening dread that the room was shrinking. The space was getting tighter, smaller, and the hands were getting closer, clawing at my legs, my arms, pulling me toward the center of the room. I screamed, really screamed, but no sound came out. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could barely breathe. My vision darkened as the room closed in, and all I could hear was the relentless whisper. You're one of us now. Just when I thought the darkness would swallow me whole, I felt it, a sudden jolt, like being pulled up from underwater. The whispers stopped. The hands disappeared. The room was still again. I gasped for air, my body drenched in cold sweat. I was lying on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, which was now back to normal. The front door was there, perfectly intact, as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew better. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak, and stumbled toward the door. My hands shook as I turned the knob, half expecting it to vanish in my grip. But it didn't. The door swung open, revealing the dark hallway outside. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Out of the building, down the street, and didn't stop until I was miles away. That was 2 years ago. I've moved 3 times since then, but it doesn't matter.
The scraping. It started again.
I sit here in my apartment, the silence pressing in from all sides. It's nightfall, and the feeling returns. At first, it's barely noticeable, like the faintest sound in the distance. But I know it's there, the scraping. It always starts quietly, as if testing to see if I'll notice. And each time I hear it, it's getting closer. It's been 2 years since the night I first heard that sound in my old apartment. 2 years since I tried to save a woman that never existed. The police called it a prank, a break-in gone wrong.
But I know better.
After that incident, I quit the force, trying to return to something like normal life. But nothing has changed. Now I sit on the floor of my bedroom, back pressed against the cold wall, the weak light from the lamp barely illuminating the room.
The apartment is quiet.
But it's only the calm before the storm.
And then, it starts again. That scraping noise.
It's coming from the ceiling, like something thin and brittle clawing its way through the walls. I try to ignore it, squeeze my eyes shut, and think of anything else.
But it gets louder, more insistent.
The rhythm is unmistakable. Every sound is like a clock ticking down, getting closer, getting faster.
I can't take it anymore.
I bolt upright, grab my bag, which I've already packed, knowing this day would come, and head for the door.
It's pointless, I know.
How many times have I done this?
3? 4?
Each time I run, it finds me again. But I can't stay here.
Not another night.
I rush out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me, but the sound stays with me. The scraping is everywhere now, in the walls, the floors, even in my own thoughts. I race down the stairs, each step echoing in the empty stairwell. My heart is pounding, legs trembling with every step. Outside, it's dark. The streets are empty, and the night presses in from all sides, thick and oppressive. I walk fast, faster, trying to keep my head up, but every few seconds, I look over my shoulder. Something's behind me.
I can feel it.
It's not just a sound anymore.
It's something else. And it's following me.
I try to call a cab, but my phone won't turn on.
Of course not.
My breath comes in short gasps as the scraping grows louder, like nails dragging along the pavement behind me. The road stretches out in front of me, seemingly endless, and the buildings on either side feel like they're closing in. And then I hear it again, footsteps this time, not just scraping.
Slow, deliberate. Stop, I whisper to myself. But it doesn't stop. I break into a run.
The road warps and twists, the streetlights flickering, casting long shadows that reach for me. I want to scream, but my throat feels tight, like I'm being strangled by invisible hands. The scraping isn't just in my head anymore. It's here, all around me. And then, something slams into my back. I hit the ground hard, my face scraping against the cold asphalt. Pain shoots through my body, but I can't move. I can feel it now, it's here. The whispers start again. They're not coming from the distance anymore. They're in my ear, surrounding me, crawling inside me. You can't escape. I try to scramble away, pushing myself up on shaky legs, but something cold wraps around my ankle.
I look down.
It's a hand thin, pale, and bone-chilling. It tightens its grip, dragging me backward, pulling me toward the shadows. I kick at it, panic taking over, and the grip loosens. But more hands, dozens of them, are reaching out from the darkness now, clawing at my legs, pulling me closer to the center of the street. I scream, but no sound comes out. The air around me is thick, suffocating.
I can't breathe. I can't think.
All I can hear is the relentless, maddening scraping.
And then I see her again, the woman. The one from the house.
Her face is twisted, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes wide and lifeless, her mouth open in a silent scream. She reaches for me, her bloody fingers outstretched, her nails broken from all the clawing. I try to close my eyes, to block her out, but I can't. She's right there, inches from my face. "You're with us now," she whispers, her breath cold against my skin. "You'll never leave." And that's when I realize, I'm not running from it anymore. I'm part of it. The scraping isn't coming from outside anymore. Now, it's inside me.